Redstone, New Mexico Territory, spring of 1884. A dry wind rattled the wooden signs of the town, carrying dust and the faint, acrid scent of smoke from the blacksmith's forge. The sun pressed down mercilessly, baking the streets, leaving the townsfolk to move only when they had to. At the center of the market square stood Eliza Hart, 23, wearing a faded green dress patched at the elbows. Her hands were tightly clenched at her sides, as if she were holding in a storm of thoughts she couldn't release. Her father, a stern man with a sun-leathered face, nudged her forward like she was a piece of property. "Anyone with coin can take her home tonight," he said, voice rough as gravel. "She can cook, sew, and stay quiet. That's worth something." The crowd muttered quietly. Women looked away, children peeked from behind skirts. Shame clung heavier than the heat. "She's had no children," her father added. "Tried for years, nothing came. But she's steady with her hands and teeth in her head. That counts for something." Eliza didn't plead. She had once, long ago, when a husband had turned his back on her, when her wedding dress had been ripped from her. Pleading hadn't helped then. She stood silent, her mother nearby, a worn shawl wrapped tight, eyes fixed on the ground. She didn't intervene, only watched, lips pressed into a firm line. Then the crowd parted, and a man stepped forward. Callum Rhodes, broad-shouldered, coat stiff with dust, wide-brimmed hat casting most of his face in shadow. He didn't inspect her like a buyer, didn't haggle. He simply pulled a leather pouch from his coat and dropped coins on the table. "She won't be judged here," he said, turning without a backward glance. Eliza bent to gather her few belongings, a small satchel, worn boots, and a brass locket with her mother's face inside. She climbed into the wagon beside the stranger. "Long ride ahead," he said, handing her a dented tin canteen. The water tasted faintly of metal and dust. Prairie stretched endlessly before them, dry and golden, as Eliza settled into the wagon beside Callum. The dust clung to her dress and hair, but she didn't care. Her hands gripped the satchel at her side as she watched the endless horizon, trying to imagine what life might be like beyond the edges of Redstone. Callum drove in silence, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, fingers loose on the reins. He spoke only once. "No one here will tell you what you're worth. Out there you choose." Eliza turned her head to watch him, studying the faint lines around his eyes, the scar that ran along his knuckle, the way his coat smelled faintly of pine and sweat. He wasn't old, maybe in his mid-30s, but the land had etched its hard lessons into him. She asked, finally, in a small, wary voice. "Why me?" He didn't answer immediately, just flicked the reins to the mules, and the wagon rolled over the uneven dirt. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Because someone had to. Because cruelty has no place here." Eliza thought about the market square, her father's face, the stairs, the silence, the shame that had weighed her down for years. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to name, relief. The ride took them past fields where the earth was cracked and dry, past lonely windmills creaking in the wind, past abandoned homesteads whose fences sagged under the weight of neglect. The world felt empty, yet alive, and the emptiness seemed to give space for possibility, as if the prairie itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what Eliza would make of it. As the sun climbed higher, she began to notice small details she hadn't seen before, the way the grass bent in waves, how the shadows of the fence posts stretched long across the dirt, how the wind carried distant calls of birds she couldn't see. Each sound, each movement, felt sharp and alive in a way she hadn't felt in Redstone. Callum's wagon finally slowed, and they came upon a ranch tucked into the dry folds of the land. The house leaned slightly to one side, as if listening to the wind. A barn stood behind it, weathered gray, and chickens darted across the yard in hurried clucks. Callum hopped down, sturdy and silent, and gestured for her to follow. Eliza stepped off the wagon, boots sinking slightly into the dry earth. The porch boards creaked under her weight, and she realized the door wasn't a proper door at all. It was a thick quilt stretched across the frame, nailed in place to block the wind. She hesitated, but Callum simply moved forward, and she followed him inside. The cabin smelled of smoke, old wood, and earth. 5 children froze at the sight of her, 4 boys and a girl, wide-eyed, cheeks flushed from the cool morning air. Their silence was heavy, not from fear, but from absence. They had lost their mother 2 winters back, and the quiet in the cabin had been louder than any storm since then. Callum introduced her simply. "This is Eliza. She'll be staying." The youngest, a boy of 5 with curly hair and bright eyes, walked straight to Callum and wrapped his small arms around his leg. Callum lifted him up effortlessly and smiled, a rare softness breaking through the stoic lines of his face. Eliza followed them inside, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know how to cook, how to sew for children, how to fill a silence that had grown heavy over the years. But she would try, because for the first time, no one was forcing her, no one was judging her, and somehow, that made all the difference. That afternoon, she tried her hand at the kitchen. Beans turned to paste, bread refused to rise, coffee scorched her fingers. She pressed her lips together, swept the floor until her arms ached, and learned the rhythm of the cabin slowly, watching the children, noting their patterns, their habits, their small joys. When a pot of stew slipped from her grip and crashed to the floor, the sound startled the hens outside and froze the children inside. Eliza's heart lurched, expecting shouts, punishment. Instead, Callum stepped in quietly, crouched, and cleaned up the mess. "It's just stew," he said, voice calm, steady. "Nothing else matters." Eliza's chest unclenched for the first time in years. Relief didn't arrive with fanfare. It came softly, quietly, like a whisper through the prairie grass. By evening, the children had begun to let her in. Small gestures, a blanket tucked around shivering shoulders, a shared smile, a whispered question, marked the beginning of a bond that didn't need words. For the first time, Eliza felt that maybe, just maybe, she belonged somewhere. The morning after her first night at the cabin dawned pale and quiet. Sunlight filtered through the thin cracks in the quilt that served as the front door, casting soft lines across the worn wooden floor. Eliza rose before the children, careful not to wake them, and stepped into the kitchen. The smell of coffee still lingered faintly, a reminder of Callum's quiet routines. She moved slowly at first, learning the rhythm of the house. Every creak of the boards beneath her boots, every whisper of wine through the cracks, felt like a secret language she had to understand. The children were still asleep, curled under quilts too thin for the cool morning. She knelt beside each one briefly, brushing stray hair from their faces, whispering soft words that carried no expectation, only presence. When the eldest, a boy named Judah, finally stirred, he watched her from the corner of his eye. There was caution there, a quiet test, but also a curiosity. Levi, Gideon, and the younger boys moved more slowly, following the example of their sister Mira, who clung to a scrap of blanket like a talisman. They had learned long ago that absence and silence often came in larger measures than presence. Breakfast was its own challenge. Eliza worked with the beans and bread again, trying to coax them into something edible. Flour dusted the counters, and the bread rose slowly, unevenly, but it rose. The children watched her with tentative expressions, waiting, not for perfection, but for the care that went into every action. Even the spilled coffee and burnt stew from the previous day had not broken the fragile trust she was beginning to build. Callum moved quietly about the yard, tending to the meals and checking fences, his hands skilled and sure. When he caught sight of Eliza struggling with a heavy bucket of water, he offered a silent nod, a wordless encouragement. It was in these quiet moments she realized that here, effort was witnessed, not judged. Intent mattered more than result. By mid-morning, the children began to drift closer, drawn not by authority, but by curiosity and the soft constancy of her presence. Mira reached out first, letting Eliza braid her hair into 2 tight ropes, tying them with a bit of blue ribbon found in an old trunk. Samson followed, holding out a small carved wooden horse for her inspection, his eyes wide with the unspoken hope that she would approve. Each small interaction wove threads of trust that had been missing in their lives, slowly transforming the cabin from a house of absence into a home. Afternoons passed in quiet labor. Eliza swept, scrubbed, stitched, and measured, her hands regaining a steadiness that had been shaken by years of judgment and loss. She learned what each child feared, what comforted them, and how to navigate the subtle rhythms of the household. And in the evening, when work slowed and the sun painted the prairie gold, she would step onto the porch and watch the world stretch endlessly around her. The land itself seemed to approve. Grass swayed gently in the wind, the fence posts leaned into the earth like old friends, and even the dust that had once seemed oppressive now carried the scent of possibility. Eliza breathed it in, feeling the weight of her past loosen just enough to let the present settle in its place. By the end of the week, small victories began to accumulate. Bread rose without fail, beans retained their shape, and even the timid children began to speak her name aloud without hesitation. Callum watched from the edge of the porch, quiet and steady, noting the subtle transformation. He said nothing. His approval was in the way he allowed her space, in the calm certainty that he would protect the household but not dictate it. That night, as stars stretched like pinpricks across the dark prairie sky, Eliza knelt by the youngest, brushing his hair back from his forehead, feeling the warmth of life in her hands. She whispered promises she didn't yet know how to keep, and yet, somehow, she felt that she already had begun. For the first time in many years, she slept with the knowledge that she was not being sold, judged, or abandoned. She belonged here, not because anyone had demanded it, but because she had chosen to be present, and they had chosen her in return. And the quiet promise of the prairie, the house, and the children whispered that this was only the beginning. The next morning, Eliza awoke to the faint light of dawn filtering through the quilted doorway. The prairie outside shimmered with dew, the wind whispering against the boards as if carrying secrets of the land. She wrapped her arms around herself, savoring the cool air, and stepped quietly to the kitchen. The children were still asleep, curled beneath thin quilts that barely kept out the early chill, their small breaths rising and falling like a gentle rhythm she had learned to follow. Breakfast was a slow, careful affair. Eliza measured flour and water, kneading dough with hands that had grown steady through repetition and patience. The smell of baking bread began to fill the cabin, mingling with the earthy scent of smoke from the fireplace. Judah, the eldest, watched from the corner with an expression that balanced suspicion and curiosity, silently evaluating her every movement. Levi leaned against the wall, whispering softly to Gideon about the bread's texture, while Mira clutched her scrap of blanket, eyes wide and attentive. Samson peeked from the edge of the table, small hands fidgeting as he tried to help without making a mess. By mid-morning, the rhythm of the household had begun to settle. Eliza swept and scrubbed, mended torn clothes, and fetched water from the well, her movements deliberate and careful. Callum worked alongside her in the yard at times, checking fences and guiding the mules, his presence steady but unobtrusive. When she faltered under the weight of a bucket, he would offer a subtle nod or a quiet word, never rushing, never imposing. By evening, when the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in deep golds and purples, Eliza would return to the porch. The prairie stretched endlessly before her, tall grasses swaying with the wind, fence posts leaning like old sentinels, and the soft clucking of chickens in the yard below. Callum stood nearby, adjusting the reins on the mules or checking the fence lines, always quiet, always present. They rarely spoke. Words weren't needed. The land, the cabin, and the small household carried their own language, one of mutual respect, shared effort, and slowly growing love. At night, after the children had been tucked into bed, Eliza would sit quietly by the fire or on the porch, watching the stars stretch across the endless prairie sky. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the dusty market square of Redstone, humiliated and alone, to a place where her hands were finally valued, her presence welcomed, and her heart quietly healed. The transformation was subtle but profound. Each day, the house grew warmer with laughter, the garden stronger under her care, and her own spirit steadier than it had been in years. The children had begun calling her Mama, a word spoken not in obligation but in recognition of the love and care she had chosen to give. And Callum, watching from the shadows of the porch or the edge of the yard, seemed to notice these changes too, his eyes softening, the tension in his posture easing. Even in the midst of hard labor, of sun-baked afternoons and long evenings, there was hope now. The kind of hope that did not demand grand gestures but grew quietly in the small acts of care, the braided hair, the mended sock, the shared smile across the cabin. And as the prairie wind blew through the tall grass, carrying the scent of earth and life, Eliza finally understood she was not just surviving here. She was beginning to live. Days flowed into weeks. Eliza woke each morning to the wind brushing the prairie and the distant calls of birds. The children had grown used to her presence, though each day brought new small tests of patience and care. Mira insisted on showing her every little discovery in the yard, an unusual rock, a bird's nest tucked in the fence, while Samson followed her like a shadow, always trying to help, always seeking approval. Eliza's hands were no longer unsteady. She could knead bread until it rose properly, sew a tear without a hitch, and fill water buckets without spilling. The rhythm of chores, the sweep of the floor, the stirring of stew, the mending of clothes, became a steady beat to which the cabin moved. Even the children began to move differently around her, their initial caution replaced by tentative trust. Callum remained a quiet presence. He seldom spoke, yet his eyes watched carefully, always noticing, always guarding. When Eliza paused from her work, she sometimes caught him staring out across the fields, lost in thought, and wondered what he remembered of his own past. Occasionally he would offer a nod, a brief word, or a small correction, never harsh, always measured. One afternoon, a mishap reminded her of the fragility of trust. Gideon, running too close to the edge of the garden, tripped over a watering bucket, scraping his knee. Eliza rushed to him, tears pricking her eyes, pressing cloth to the wound, murmuring soft reassurances. Callum arrived moments later, his steady hands helping her keep Gideon calm, his voice low but firm. "It's all right. You've got him." That moment, quiet but intense, cemented something unspoken between them, the shared responsibility, the silent partnership in this fragile, makeshift family. Evenings brought the soft comfort of small rituals. The children huddled together on the porch, listening to Eliza hum old lullabies, or following her, as she tended the small garden, coaxing stubborn plants to life. The prairie stretched on beyond the fence, golden and endless, carrying the promise of tomorrow, and slowly, for the first time in years, Eliza felt a sense of belonging she had never known in Redstone. Spring gave way to early summer, and the ranch began to hum with life. Eliza's hands, once unsteady, moved with quiet confidence, kneading bread, scrubbing floors, tending the small garden that had begun to flourish under her care. The children no longer watched her with hesitation. Instead, they imitated her, laughed with her, and trusted her guidance. Mira showed her the secret corners of the yard where wildflowers peeked through cracks in the dry earth. Samson, ever curious, followed her every step, eager to carry her tools or hold her hand. Even Judah, the eldest, softened, occasionally offering advice or quietly helping with chores, his pride slowly giving way to respect. Callum remained watchful but unobtrusive, his eyes often lingering on Eliza as she moved through the house and yard. He seldom spoke, yet every nod or small gesture carried reassurance. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the prairie gold, he came to her side in the garden. Without words, he handed her a small, hand-carved bird. She smiled, understanding that the quiet gestures, like the small carved bird, the shared labor, the trust between them, spoke louder than any words could. Even in the long, hot days, the rhythm of the ranch steadied them all. The children grew more confident, the garden more alive, and Eliza discovered a sense of purpose and belonging she had never known. In the quiet moments, as the wind brushed through the prairie and the sun dipped behind the hills, she finally allowed herself to believe that perhaps, at last, she had found a place to call home. Summer deepened, the prairie sun relentless, turning the earth a dry, golden brown. Yet the little ranch thrived under Eliza's care. Every morning, she rose before dawn, hands wrapped in cloth to protect the calluses she was forming from tending the garden and hauling water. The small vegetables, herbs, and flowers that she planted now grew taller than she remembered, bending in the wind, resilient as the children who followed her every step. The children's trust in her grew with each passing day. Samson learned to carry water without spilling a drop, Gideon began to help with sweeping and feeding the chickens, and Mira started to hum the old lullabies Eliza softly sang while scrubbing floors or kneading dough. Even Judah, once silent and wary, joined in, passing tools or offering guidance, his pride now tempered by respect. The cabin, once quiet with absence, now hummed with small sounds of laughter, chatter, and soft footsteps, an orchestra of a family in formation. Callum remained largely in the background, tending the barn, fixing fences, or checking the mules. Yet when he walked past her, sometimes brushing dirt from her apron or offering a rare smile, it spoke volumes. Words were few between them, but the silence had grown warm and comforting, filled with unspoken understanding. One afternoon, after a long morning of work in the sun-baked fields, Callum handed Eliza a leather-bound journal he had found in a nearby abandoned homestead. Inside were sketches, notes about the land, and small records of daily chores. Eliza traced the pages with her fingers, marveling at the meticulous details, realizing that care could be expressed in many forms. That evening, they worked side by side in the garden, her hands in the soil, his rough hands repairing the fence posts that had leaned under the summer wind. She looked up at him, dust on her cheeks, apron wrinkled, hair loose in the wind. He didn't speak, only nodded toward a crooked tomato vine that had survived the heat. A small smile tugged at her lips. Evenings grew longer, and the air cooler. Fireflies began to flicker among the tall prairie grass, and the children would chase them with squeals of delight, their laughter drifting into the sky. Eliza would watch, a quiet warmth settling in her chest, feeling that the bond she had forged was unbreakable, growing like the garden she nurtured. She began to understand that home was not a building, not a place, but a life built together, day by day, hand by hand, heart by heart. And through it all, the prairie stretched endlessly, golden and alive, bearing witness to a woman's determination, a man's quiet strength, and 5 children learning to trust and love again. The rhythms of work, care, and laughter settled into a new normal, and for the first time, Eliza could look to the horizon and feel hope instead of fear. The days grew shorter as autumn arrived, painting the prairie in shades of amber, russet, and gold. The wind carried a chill now, and the garden's lushness began to fade, yet the cabin remained warm with laughter, work, and small triumphs. Eliza moved through her chores with practiced ease, kneading bread, mending clothes, filling buckets with water, but each movement now carried confidence, not fear. Her hands were calloused, her back strong, but her heart was light, full of a sense of belonging she had never known. Callum worked alongside her less formally now. Some mornings he joined her in the garden, other times he repaired fences or sharpened tools, but always, his eyes found her. It wasn't a question of words, they had never needed many, but of trust, respect, and quiet acknowledgement. In the evenings, he would lean against a post, watching the children play, or offer a small nod when Eliza accomplished something without asking for approval. The children had grown into their roles too. Samson carried water without spilling, Gideon helped with the animals, Levi learned to mend broken things, Judah oversaw the small projects with careful hands, and Mira, once shy and hesitant, laughed freely while tying up bundles of herbs or braiding scraps of cloth into ribbons. They were no longer just children surviving, they were a family, and Eliza, once a stranger, had become their center. One afternoon, a stranger rode up the long dirt path, a government official with maps and papers, offering money for the land, a new opportunity, and promises of progress. They spoke of rail lines cutting through the ridge, houses, schools, and security for the children. Eliza looked at the maps, but her hands were in the soil, fingers brushing through the last remnants of summer vegetables. She glanced at Callum, who stood silently, hat low against the sun, eyes on the horizon. "We're not selling," he said quietly, his voice steady. The men hesitated, tried again, but Beau's resolve never wavered. The prairie, the cabin, the garden, and the family they had built mattered more than money, more than promises. They left, maps folded, their questions unanswered. Eliza walked among the remaining vegetables, touching the leaves and stems, feeling the rhythm of life she had helped cultivate. The children gathered around, hands sticky with soil or bits of bread, their laughter light in the cool wind. She realized then that this was more than a home. It was proof that resilience, care, and quiet determination could bloom even in dry, harsh soil. That night, As the fire flickered and the stars emerged above the prairie, Eliza sat on the porch, the children tucked in, Callum beside her, silent but present. For the first time in her life, she felt entirely unafraid to be herself, entirely certain that love, in its quiet, steady way, was more valuable than judgment, money, or fleeting approval. She understood now that the greatest strength was not in being chosen, but in choosing, again and again, to nurture, protect, and care, even when the world had long since stopped asking her worth. The following spring, the prairie bloomed brighter than ever. Eliza's hands, calloused and steady, moved through the garden with a quiet confidence. Corn and sunflowers leaned toward the sun, beans twisted up the fence posts, and herbs filled the air with a fragrant mix. The children ran, laughed, and argued over small tasks, every sound a sign of life reclaimed. Callum Rhodes stood at the edge of the porch, hat pushed back, watching. He didn't need to speak. Every glance, every gesture, spoke of respect, gratitude, and a shared life built on quiet strength. The ranch wasn't just land, it was resilience, care, and love made visible. Time passed in rhythms of seasons, each one teaching lessons of patience and persistence. Droughts came, frost nipped the crops, and storms lashed the roof, yet Eliza's hands always found a way. She had learned that life wasn't about what others valued in you but what you chose to cultivate in yourself and those around you. The children had found a home, a guide, a mother in her, and she had found belonging, purpose, and partnership with Callum, not because anyone demanded it, but because love grows quietly where it is nurtured. Years later, when travelers passed the ranch, they slowed to read the simple wooden sign nailed at the fence's edge. It bore only 2 words. Not for sale. Those who knew the story saw more than words. They saw a place where choices mattered, where respect and care shaped a life, and where love was not a possession but a shared, living thing. Eliza and Callum grew old together, the children grown and scattered, yet the ranch remained full of life, proof that what is nurtured with patience, courage, and compassion endures far beyond expectation. Lesson: life's true worth isn't measured by others' judgment, wealth, or titles. It's measured by care, patience, resilience, and the courage to choose love, kindness, and purpose for yourself and those you touch. What you cultivate with your hands and heart leaves a legacy no one can take away. CTA. If this story touched your heart, let us know how it made you feel in the comments below. Share your favorite moment, and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, love, and life in the Wild West.